I don't remember when, but you know how we met her? Because
Recording in progress, the lady says. Okay. Sponges. Before going into the sources and the underlying ideas, which happen to be fairly complicated, before going into the underlying ideas and sources, I just want to begin with the conclusion. I want to begin at the end. I took just one standard handbook of kashrus, written by Rav Schwartz. He passed away around half a year ago. And I just chose his handbook because he was a teacher of mine. So but you can find the same ideas in any standard handbook of kashrus. So the bottom line is as follows: Sfoge v'chatza, the sponges you use for cleaning dishes, utensils, pots, pans, the sponges you use for cleaning utensils, and the soap which you use, you should have separate sponges for milk and meat utensils. But you don't need a third sponge for parva. You can use either the milchik sponge or the fleischik sponge for parva. That doesn't matter. Hamedaktikim, people who are more mahmir, nahagu l'hakpid b'mishcha l'rechtzat kelim. People who are more mahmir have separate soap for the milchik and fleischik. He's not talking about liquid soap that comes out of a bottle. He's talking about mishcha, cream, which comes in a tub, and you always have to put the sponge into the tub. And therefore it's a good chumrah, but not required, to have separate tubs of soft soap for milk and fleischik, separate for milk and fleischik. Achatam nifgam af me'achilas kelev al yedei chomrei nikui. But as long as soap is involved in the sponge, as long as there's soap in the sponge, the soap is going to ruin the taste of any remnants of food which are in the sponge. Any remnants of food which are in the sponge, on the sponge, are going to taste bad. And therefore, they will not prohibit anything they come in contact with. יש לחוש שמן נופלת חתיכת עבה של מזון שאינה נפגמת על ידי סבון. The only chashash, the only problem could be a big piece of junk, a big piece of cheese, a big chunk of cheese, or a big chunk of meat on the sponge, which is so big that not all of it came in contact with the soap and had its taste ruined, and then falls into the other kind of food. This is, of course, highly improbable. Indeed, it's hard to imagine how that would happen. So bottom line, the conclusion we're going to come to after we look at the sources is lechatchila. You need separate sponges for milk and meat. Either of those sponges can be used for parva utensils, and b'diavad, if a mistake was made and the fleischik utensils were washed up with the milchik sponge or the other way around, b'diavad, nothing is going to be prohibited unless it's this weird situation where such a large piece of cheese or such a large piece of meat somehow got cooked into the other kinds of utensils. And I can't imagine a scenario where that's actually going to happen. That's the bottom line conclusion. Now, let's see the reasons for all of this. We begin with the Mechaber. The Mechaber, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, is Reb Yosef Karo. I studied, I confess the imperfect aspects of my past. I studied in Ashkenazic institutions. And in Ashkenaz institutions, Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, is always called HaMechaber, the author. The author means the author of the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo. In Sephardic, in Rabbi Yosef Karo is not usually referred to as HaMechaber, the author. He's usually referred to as Maran, our master, Maran, our master. Well, we're talking about the same person. In any event, he wrote as follows: Ki'arot shel basar, utensils, which are meaty, pots, pans, dishes, doesn't matter what, shehudachu, that were washed, biyoreh cholevet, in a milchik pot. How do they wash dishes in those days? You take a big pot, you heat up the water in a big pot, and in the warm water, you wash the dishes. They didn't have a faucet, a tap that you just turn on in the sink, right? So we have fleischik dishes being washed in warm water in a milchik pot. Chamin, and it's hot. Yatzalet behen, very hot, because the hotter the water, the easier it is to wash the dishes. So, of course, the water in the pot is made very hot. So that's the situation. Fleischik pot, washed in hot water in a milchik utensil. Afilu shnehem b'nei yomen, even though all the utensils in this story are b'nei yoman, had recently been used, and we know that they're not clean because we're washing them. The whole reason we're doing this is because there's remnants of fat and meat and so forth on the dishes and the pots. We know they're not clean. Nonetheless, mutar, it's fine, it's okay. Because, as we learned last week, twice removed taste, if we start with something permitted, as long as we're talking about kosher meat and kosher cheese, as long as we're talking about kosher stuff, twice removed taste becomes parva. When the taste of the milk comes out of the big pot in which you're doing the washing up, the taste is given into the water. From the water, it's given into the dishes and cutlery that you're washing up. That's twice removed. And once milchik taste is twice removed, it becomes parva. And of course, the entire scenario be reversed. Milchik utensils being washed in a fleischik pot, exactly the same. Entirely permissible. V'husha yomar, and this depends upon the following condition: Hare li shaloya shum shuman davuk b'hem. All this assumes that there was no shuman, no fat, no fleischik fat involved. Even though I said a few moments ago, it's obvious that there has to be fleischik fat here, because why else are we washing up the dishes? The Ramah adds, Yesh Osrim, even though the Shulchan Aruch was lenient, the Ashkenaz authorities are strict. And the Ashkenaz authorities are strict. Afilu ein shuman davuk b'hem. Even if there's no actual meat, even if there's no actual cheese in this whole story, even if the fleischik utensils were used entirely for parva food and are being washed up in a milchik utensil, even though there's no real meat and no real cheese in the situation, Ashkenaz poskim are still strict. Ela im kein achad min hakelim eino b'nei yomo, unless at least one of the kalim had not been used for over 24 hours. As we learned last week, once the utensil has not been used for 24 hours or longer, it loses its ability to prohibit anything else. Okay, let's understand what we have up till this point. There's a machlokes between the Machaber and the Ramah. But bottom line, in the most common situation, in the most common case, they agree that if you're washing utensils, either milk or fleischik, and the utensils have on them remnants of cheese or remnants of meat, and you're washing those utensils together with other utensils of the other kind, well, they all agree that this is prohibited and you should not do it. Now we have to start thinking about the sponge. The sponge is something which was used to wash fleischik to start with, and now if you're using it in contact with milk dishes, and if it is hot, if you're using hot water, then the taste is going to move, and that's exactly parallel to the situation which the Mechaber and the Ramah, the Ashkenaz and the Sephardic poskim are against and prohibit. According to this, if you use a fleischik sponge on a milchik dish or the other way around, and it is hot, hot means yad soleded bo, over the temperature that would burn your hands, then it's prohibited according to both the Mechaber and the Ramah. At this point, we have to turn to the question of exactly how to determine the heat. Now here, I don't know if men's hands, for some reason, seem to be far more sensitive to hot water than women's hands. I've not done a systematic survey. I only observe what goes on in my own family. But as far, I don't know how typical this is, but in my family, I observed that the women folk wash up dishes with what the men folk consider water too hot to touch. And if the men folk have to wash up the dishes, the women folk are not happy with that because they're not using hot enough water. Well, at what temperature is yad soleded bo? What's the temperature of cooking? If the water is not hot, then surely there's not going to be a problem b'diavad. If the water is too hot, then we're going to have a problem here. We have to be able to define the temperature. Let's begin with the Ben Ish Chai. Ben Ish Chai was the great Rav of Baghdad, 19th century. He wrote as follows: Kol davar shalon nitbashel kodem Shabbos, ein shorin oto b'Shabbos b'chamin sheyad soleded bo. The temperature of yad soleded bo, the temperature at which water will burn the hand, is important in two different areas of halacha. This is the temperature that defines cooking on Shabbos, raising meat, anything, to the temperature of yad soleded bo will cook the food and therefore constitute a Torah violation on Shabbos. And the same temperature is important in kashrut because that's the temperature at which absorption of taste and release of taste takes place in utensils. What is the heat of yad soleded bo? Din chamin sheyad soleded bo. How do we figure out whether or not it's that hot or not? Ein misharin be'etzbah. You do not judge by putting a finger in. Putting your finger into the water is not the way to decide whether or not it's yad soleded, but whether it's over or under the temperature of cooking, whether it's over or under the temperature of absorption and release of taste. Ella, instead, im tomah, if you will say, if you will ask, how is it possible? What's a practical way to know whether or not a situation is yad soleded bo, too hot? Hine, nakit haiklo biyadcha. Hold the following rule in your hand. This is the way to decide. Kol hecha, in any situation, shezeh chamin. In any situation that the hot water, the hot beverage, the hot food, with the hot whatever it is, in any situation where it's so hot, ra'ui l'shtiya ul'achila, but you can still drink it or eat it, if you are able to eat it or drink it, ein adam nimna mekoach ribui chamimuto, if it's something that you would eat and it's not too hot to eat, if it's not too hot to drink, then it's also not yad soleted bo. Yad soleted bo is too hot to eat or too hot to drink. That's the rule that you should hold in your hand in order to decide whether or not something is cooking on Shabbos, that would be the temperature, or whether or not this absorption and release of taste. If it's drinkable or edible, it's not that temperature. Yad soleted bo is only if it's so hot you cannot eat it or cannot drink it. Now, he lived in 19th century Baghdad, which was just beginning to modernize. The city of Baghdad in the 19th century was just coming out of the Middle Ages and entering the modern world. Let's talk for a moment about thermometers. The thermometer was invented by a Danish scientist in the 17th century. His name was Römer. He invented the first thermometer, and indeed the scale, the Römer scale on the thermometer, is still in use in certain engineering applications. You don't encounter it very often. But he invented the first thermometer prior to the 17th century, when Römer in Denmark invented the first thermometer. There was no such idea as measuring temperature. The very idea of temperature, the very idea of measuring temperature didn't exist prior to the 17th century. It's a modern idea. Römer had a disciple whose name was Fahrenheit. Fahrenheit refined the thermometer, made some improvements, and among the improvements that Fahrenheit made was a new scale on the thermometer. He established the new scale by going out on the hottest summer day in Denmark and measuring the highest temperature he could measure on the hottest summer day, and he made that 100. Then in the coldest winter, he went out in Denmark and found the coldest place he could find in Denmark in the winter, measured the temperature, and he called that 0. That's the Fahrenheit scale, which is still in use in some backward countries in the world today, where it goes from 0 to 100. In that scale, the boiling temperature is 212. In that scale, the freezing temperature of water is 32 degrees. Well, that scale is highly impractical, but still in use in some countries which have not yet joined modernity. In the 19th century, the centigrade scale was introduced, where the boiling point of water was set at 100 and the freezing point of water was set at 0, and that the centigrade scale, introduced by a scientist by the name of Celsius, that's the scale which is in most common use all over the world today. Now, on the modern thermometer, Rav Moshe Feinstein took some measurements, and he wrote that one could be mahmir. He lived in America, which was still using Fahrenheit. 110 degrees Fahrenheit is the lowest temperature that Yad Soledet could possibly be. He said it might be, Yad Soledet might be as high as 160 degrees centigrade. That is, he thought Yad Soledet Bo is somewhere between 43 and 71 degrees centigrade. He wasn't sure exactly where in that space it felt. the OU in America, which is the largest kashrus organization in the world, their standard is 126 degrees in that American scale. That's 50 degrees centigrade. That's the temperature at which they say absorption and release of taste occurs. And when it comes to establishing the kashrut of a factory or kashering a factory, well, if everything in the factory is under 50 degrees centigrade, there's no absorption or no release at all, and the machinery just has to be clean. Now, I personally am unhappy with assigning a specific temperature on the thermometer. I'm unhappy with assigning a specific temperature as the temperature of Yad Saledidbo. I'll give you a few examples, and you'll understand why I am unhappy. I frequently bake bread. Now, as you might know, baking bread requires a very high oven temperature. Unlike cakes, which are typically baked at a lower temperature, the reason bread requires a high baking temperature is because the yeast in the dough, yeast is what causes the bread to rise. Yeast in the dough must be killed. Yeast is a living organism, and it must be killed very quickly in the oven. If it's not killed very quickly in the oven, then in certain areas in the dough, the yeast will continue to live, and those certain areas in the dough will continue to rise, whereas other areas of the dough, the yeast is already dead, and those areas, well, you get a very lumpy loaf of bread if you do not kill all the yeast very quickly when it goes into the oven. And therefore baking bread requires very hot ovens. I bake bread at, depending upon the recipe, somewhere between 200 and 220 degrees centigrade. That's very hot. One prepares the dough. You have to preheat the oven because you want to kill all the yeast very quickly. So you can't put the dough into a cold oven and slowly warm it up. That defeats the whole purpose. And I put the dough on a piece of aluminum foil, unless of course I'm in a Commonwealth country, in which case I would put the dough on aluminum foil. I pick up the foil and, well, first I open the oven door, pick up the foil, put my arms into the oven and place the foil on the rack. Close the oven door, come back 20 minutes later, 25 minutes, 30 minutes. It depends upon, again, the recipe and how big the loaf is. The loaf is done. I open the oven door. I reach in, grab the foil, pick it up, take it out of the oven, and put it on a cooling rack on the shayesh, on the counter. Now, the foil, which had been in the oven for at least 25 minutes by this point, has reached the ambient temperature of 200, 220 degrees, far above what any posek considers to be Yad Saledidbo. Nonetheless, I've never burnt my fingers by grabbing it, picking it up, and taking it out of the oven. Of course, if I would pick up the bread itself, if I put my hands on the bread, I would scald I would get probably second-degree burns, maybe even third-degree burns on my hands if I did that. But the aluminium foil, which is exactly the same temperature as the ambient air in the oven, exactly the same as the bread, does not burn the hands. It's not temperature which burns hands. It's energy, heat capacity, and since the aluminum foil is so thin, there's not much heat capacity in it. The heat is dissipated very quickly and therefore doesn't burn hands. There are many factors which go into burning the flesh, and temperature is the least important factor. For this reason, I personally favor the approach of the Ben Ish Chai. The Ben Ish Chai presents us with an experiential rule for measuring what is Yad Soleted Bo. You can experience it yourself by seeing whether it's too hot to eat or drink. And of course, depending upon the density of the food that you're eating, the temperature at which it's too hot to eat will vary depending upon its density. But it's an experiential fact which does not require this newfangled modern invention called a thermometer that did not exist in antiquity back in the days when they had no concept of measuring temperature at all. I'll give you one more example before we go on. For matzah, to bake matzah for Pesach, it's essential that the water be room temperature. If the water is not room temperature, if the water is warm, then we are afraid that that will stimulate rising, right? That's why you put the dough in a warm place to stimulate the rising. Using warm water stimulates rising. The water for matzah must be room temperature. And indeed, the Shulchan Aruch insists that the water be collected a day before and let to stand overnight so that it reaches room temperature, that it reaches room temperature before kneading the dough. The Maharil back in the 15th century wrote that you cannot use the water which melts from snow or glaciers. Pesach is in the springtime when the mountains, when the snow and the glaciers in the mountains are melting. The melt off from the snow and the glaciers in the springtime, that's what feeds the rivers. But that water cannot be used. The runoff, the melt off of snow cannot be used for baking matzah because, the Maharil says, Eila mayim rotchim. That's very hot water. And we cannot use hot water for baking matzah. The water, which is the melt off of snow and ice, is very hot water that we cannot use. Now, of course, the thermometer tells a very different story. According to the thermometer, it is impossible for water to be any colder than that. It's just the slightest bit above zero. If the water would be just the slightest bit colder, it wouldn't be water at all. It would be ice. According to the story told by the thermometer, the melt off of snow is the coldest water that can possibly exist. According to the Maharil, that's called mayim rotchim. That's called hot water. The difference between these two views is that one is experiential and the other isn't. If you have ever lived in a cold place, like the Alps, up in the Swiss Alps, if you ever lived in an environment which is very, very cold, then you might have had the experience that I had when I was a youngster. It's a long time ago when I was a child. My mother would send us outside to play in the cold, and all the children would play outside in the cold. And then as the children are playing, they get colder and colder and colder. Soon their lips start to turn blue and their teeth start to chatter and their ears start to ache. Anyone who's experienced real cold knows what I mean when I say the ears begin to ache. And then at some point, mother calls to the children, come into the house and warm up. The children abandon their play and come into the house. And what does mother say when the children come into the house? Children, wash your hands before getting biscuits and milk. So, of course, turn on the cold water, put your hands under the cold water, and it feels so hot. It feels so warm. The reason it feels so warm is because the water, the cold water, is far warmer than the skin, which is so cold because it was out in the snow and ice. Experientially, the water feels warm. And that's true. If one goes out from a warm house and then uh, let your hands get very cold, and then put your hands into water, which is just a little bit over 0 degrees, the water feels so warm because it is in fact much warmer than the skin on your hands. That's the experience of warmth. So here you have many reasons why I am partial to the approach of Ben Ish Chai, but I'm surely not going to anyone following the poskim using a thermometer for determining what is and what is not yad soledadbo, the temperature at which absorption and release of taste occurs. Now, there's one other important consideration here in Igros Moshe. Igros Moshe, when he came to the United States from Eastern Europe, but he was from his little village where they had no electricity, they had no running water. I mean, they were living in the Middle Ages still in this village he came from in Russia. And he comes to New York, and he found many things surprising when he came to New York. Uh, Automobiles, trains, cars. Uh, you didn't have to carry water from the well to the kitchen. They have these taps. You just turn on the water, and out comes the water. Not only that, they have two taps, two faucets, one hot, one cold. And if you turn on the hot water, it comes out very hot. In fact, too hot to use. They also have showers. Right? In the village in Russia, no one had ever heard of a shower. And no one had a bathtub at home. They had banyas. The banya, you had to go to the public bathhouse. The say what you like about Lenin. Lenin did a lot of horrible things, but one thing Lenin did do was build banyas. He built public baths in every village throughout the Soviet Union. He was really a big builder of banyas, bathhouses. In any event, Igros Moshe thought about how the plumbing system works. There are hot water pipes and there are cold water pipes. The hot water pipes and the cold water pipes meet each other in your kitchen. And when you turn on both faucets, both taps, out comes a mixture of hot and cold water. Well, since the hot water is being cooled by the cold water, and since the hot water has traveled a great distance through pipes from the boiler until it eventually comes out of your house, Igros Moshe Feinstein was of the opinion that the water coming out of the faucet, coming out of the tap in your kitchen, cannot be considered yad soleded bo because it's already been cooled off. Number one, by the long trip, the long journey through the pipes, and number two, by the mixture of cold water just before it comes out of the tap, just before it comes out of the faucet. Therefore, in your kitchen, you surely do not have any water, which is yad soleded bo, in your sink. And therefore, the question of absorption and release of taste does not apply when you're washing up dishes with hot water coming from the sink, coming from the taps in the sink. That was his opinion. And this is an opinion which is then generally embraced by other poskim. According to this, there's no issue of absorption and release of taste in ordinary washing up of utensils, even if you use hot water in the kitchen sink. Therefore, b'diavad, if the wrong sponge was used, all is well, and the utensils are all still kosher and should be continued to be used as they were used previously. The sponge, on the other hand, now has bits of cheese in it and bits of meat, if it was used incorrectly, and therefore the sponge requires koshering. The simplest way to kosher a sponge, of course, is just to put it in the laundry and wash it together with dirty clothing. If you do that, as I do, just rinse the sponge a number of times in the sink before putting the sponge into the washing machine, because you don't want a little soap. One of the big problems in washing machines is foam. If there's too much foam, the clothes do not get washed very well. Therefore, the detergents which are used for washing machines are detergents that are technically called surface active agents, surfactants. They are surfactants. They are cleaning agents which do not produce foam. Well, they did not produce foam when they were first introduced in the market, but the customers were unhappy with that. Everyone was accustomed to seeing the foam when you use soap. And since there was no visible foam, people thought their clothing was not getting cleaned. And therefore, a little bit of foaming agent is added to the detergents nowadays so that you'll see some foam in your washing machine. Gives you a good feeling. You think the washing is going better, but really the foam has nothing to do with it. If you put a sponge full of dish soap into the washing machine, you're going to get a lot of foam, and that foam is going to interfere with the washing in the machine. So rinse out the sponge before you put it into the washing machine. Well, once the sponge has been washed in a regular washing cycle, it is now parva, and you can use it either for milk or meat or whatever you want. Let's go one step further. Yes. Yira Eli, it seems to me, the Shulchan Aruch says, Im natnu efer b'mayim, if you put ashes into the water that you're using to wash your utensils, putting ashes into the water to washing the utensils with ashes? Well, believe it or not, that's exactly what people were doing for centuries. And the reason they were doing it for centuries is because ashes have high potassium content. In fact, the word potassium is just potassium, ash. You take the ashes, put them in a pot of water, and the water leaches out the potassium from the ashes. It's a rich source of potassium, and until modern mining developed, ashes were the primary source of potassium. You add a little bit of calcium carbonate. That's a chemical word for chalk, right? Chalk is a mineral all over the place. Chalk can be found in the earth. You mix a little bit of chalk in, that's calcium carbonate, and you get KOH. You get potassium hydroxide. Now, potassium hydroxide, which is the product of putting ashes into the wash-up water, that is soap. That's what our ordinary soap nowadays is made out of sodium hydroxide. But as you know, sodium and potassium are just above each other in the periodic table. The chemical characteristics of sodium hydroxide used today and potassium oxide, which is derived from ashes and has been used for centuries until modern technology developed. They're very similar. Very similar characteristics. What they use nowadays, the sodium hydroxide is stronger, has a better effect, but the potassium hydroxide works perfectly well in cleaning dishes as well. Well, if you put ashes into the hot water, which you're going to use for washing up the utensils, af al pi shashuman davuk behem, then even though we have real meat and real cheese, mutar, it's okay. Al yedei ha'ef nosein tam lefgam, the ashes ruin the taste of anything. And once the taste is ruined, the food loses its ability to prohibit anything else. Therefore, just as in those days, putting ashes into the wash-up water would ruin the taste of any remnants of milk and meat, similarly, using modern dishwashing liquid or whatever you use to wash the dishes with is going to ruin the taste of anything in the sponge, and therefore any remnants of meat will no longer be able to prohibit milchik dishes or the other way around. Here we have an additional reason for leniency. The Chavis Das, one of the principal commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, writes, therefore, im nafal burit ha'asui me'efer v'chelev v'cholav gamkein mutar, therefore, even if there was a mistake with milk and meat, if soap is involved, then all is well. I should point out in passing that the way to make soap, the soap making procedure is called saponification. Saponification means soap making. The way soap is made, well, yeah, it's still made this way. It's made for centuries. The same method has been used. You take fat. The cheapest fat is, of course, animal fat. The more expensive fats, you can use olive oil as a kind of fat. Olive oil works perfectly well to make soap, but it's much more expensive than animal fat. Animal fat is the cheapest source of fat. You take animal fat and you add potassium hydroxide from the ashes, or nowadays they use sodium hydroxide, and that produces soap. The reaction between the base, the oxide, and the fat. Fats are acidic. A fat is a long-chain fatty acid. Fats are all acidic. The reaction between the fat and the base, the hydroxide, that's a oxidation reduction reaction. That's a very common form of chemical reaction, and it produces soap. That's what soap is. And the Mishnah Brura is very interested in the following question. Back in those days, when soap was homemade, as it still was in Russia in the days of the Mishnah Brura, the way you would make soap at home is take fat, add to it the hydroxide, mix it, and the question arises, how do you know when you've put in enough hydroxide? How do you know when the reaction is done and the soap is finished? If you don't put in enough hydroxide, you're going to end up with a lot of fat. It's not going to clean anything. Put in too much hydroxide, and the hydroxide is really ruinous if it touches the skin. And nowadays you use gloves and protective goggles when you do this. It's absolutely ruinous if it touches the skin. So you want to have exactly the right amount of hydroxide so you have a perfect soap product with no fat left in it and no hydroxide left in it. Only, well, the way they figured out whether the reaction is finished is by tasting it. Soap doesn't taste very good, but when it tastes like soap is supposed to taste, then you know the reaction is completed and you stop adding the hydroxide. Well, of course, the cheapest fat available was usually fat from non-kosher slaughtering, from non-kosher animals. Are you allowed to taste the soap while you are making it? Mishnah Brura says, of course you're allowed to taste it, because even if the process is not completed, it's really going to taste bad. It's not going to have a good taste. And therefore, you can surely taste it to determine whether or not it's not. Of course, in modern chemical engineering, all this is unheard of. One would not let any chemical reaction come anywhere near the mouth or near the tongue, but that's the way they used to do it. I'm old enough to remember in analytic chemistry, when we were taught analytic chemistry, one of the methods we were taught to identify what's in the test tube is to smell it or taste it, see how it feels in the fingers. These are all important clues to determine what's in the test tube in analytic chemistry. And nowadays, all of this is completely verboten. Nowadays, all this is considered far too dangerous. Well, it was too dangerous then as well, but no one cared in those days. Now, this big leniency of the Shulchan Aruch, according to which ashes or soap, which are in practice the same thing, detergent is in practice the same thing, ruins the taste and therefore eliminates problems of mixtures of milk and meat in the sponge. The Shach, in his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, says, Dinzeh is halacha in the Shulchan Aruch. Remember, the Shulchan Aruch began with the words Yera Eli. It seems to me that the presence of ashes, it seems to me that the presence of soap or detergent eliminates any problem. The Shach says this din lo nimtza the taste and therefore eliminates any problems of absorption and release of taste. And therefore, the Shach is not happy with this approach. However, the Yad Yehuda, representing by far the mainstream thinking of the poskim, says, Efer b'mayim hu pagam gartel v'nirgash l'kol. Put ashes into water, taste it, and everyone will agree that it tastes bad. This is a simple experiential fact that you don't need a source in the Gemara or the Tosafos to tell you that it tastes bad. Just taste it and you'll establish the facts yourself. And it's very bad. Pagam gadol. Hine, vadai im kenhu. Kol harayot lo yachishu davar shenira le'einayim de'eno kain. It doesn't matter what's in the Gemara. It doesn't matter what the Tosafos said. It doesn't matter what any of the earlier poskim say. It's a simple fact that it tastes horrible, and therefore the Shulchan Aruch is correct. I checked it out myself. I experimented. I mixed ashes with hot water. But I was able to drink it. Stam efer me'etzu davar she'ein bo shum tam. And the ashes, therefore, after all, the ashes come from wood. Wood is tasteless, most trees. And therefore, the ashes really don't add a lot of taste to the water. Agam, but as long as the ashes are mixed with the water, you still don't want to drink it because the ashes are going to get stuck in your mouth. It's like drinking water mixed with mud. It's not a question of taste. You just don't want it to get stuck in your mouth. Just because you don't want it to get stuck in your mouth doesn't necessarily mean that it tastes bad. Well, therefore, maybe the Shulchan Aruch is right. We're left now with failure to decide one way or another whether we can rely upon the leniency of the Shulchan Aruch. Turning to the poskim of the 20th century, which I consider contemporary, The Aruch HaShulchan mentions both opinions, and he says, well, how are we going to determine whether something is a bad taste or not? HaTorah, v'aposkim lo dibru rak b'hagala al yedei mayim bilvad. The poskim never approached this question of what mixed with the water makes it taste bad. Hachush me'id she'ein lecha pagum yoter me'efa b'tavshil. But if ashes fall into the food, no one's going to want to eat the food. Even if you're able to strain out the ashes, people are still going to be reluctant to eat the food. Some of the taste of ashes will remain. And therefore, it seems to me that what is called zaif, that's the Yiddish word for soap, is definitely pagum, and therefore it make the taste of anything else bad. And the Shulchan Aruch is right, at least with respect to modern soap. Chazon Ish, reliably strict posek, who prohibits just about everything imaginable. In this case, he agreed. Bizmanenu mine chomarim sheminakim behem et hakederot, the kinds of soap used nowadays, the kinds of materials used nowadays, he wrote this in the middle of the 20th century, which we use nowadays to wash our pots and pans, our dishes, well, the water gets mixed with them and they become non-drinkable once the dish soap is mixed with the water. It's not drinkable, and the dishes get very clean, but it's surely no same tam lefgam, and therefore, even if a mistake is made, b'diavad, all is going to be well. One could go on and on with poskim, going along the same line of thinking. Bottom line, I started with the bottom line, the summary at the beginning. Of course, you should have separate sponges for milk and meat. Either of those sponges can be used for parva. B'diavad, if the dishes were washed up with the wrong sponges, b'diavad, all is well. Only the sponge requires koshering, and that can be accomplished by simply laundering it. With this, I will pause and ask you if you have any questions.
Hatchila, one doesn't need a separate parv sponge.
You don't need a separate parva sponge. If you want to, it might make life easier for you. But we recently moved into this new apartment, and the previous owners had a kitchen with 3 sinks in it. We have a parva sink. Well, it just makes life a lot easier for lazy people like me, who don't always wash up the dishes immediately after the meal. So the parva stuff can just sit in the parva sink until I get around to washing it. And if it makes life easier for you and you want to spend the money, go for it.
But halachically, lahatchila, you don't need to.
Correct. The milchik dishes, the parva dishes, if you have parva utensils, they can be washed in either the milchik or the fleischik sink with either the milchik or fleischik sponge. Correct.
If I had heard this shir many years ago, would have done a lot for my shalom bayit.
Oh, well, okay. Okay, well.
Never.
Then you have to tell the younger generation.
It's okay. It's time for us too. Oh my goodness, the drama that goes around, that's been going on sometimes around our sponges and using the wrong sponge.
Yeah, okay. On another occasion, we can talk about use of sponges on Shabbos, but that's a separate issue. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Any other issues to address now?
Don't think so.
Okay. And I wish you a good week and a safe week. Today is Pesach Sheni. I wish you a happy Pesach Sheni. If it's still Pesach Sheni in your areas, I don't know. No longer here. It's still Pesach Sheni. In fact, I'm going to have my lunch with matzah now. Okay.
Enjoy.
Thank you very much. It was very, very informative. Learned a lot. Thank you, Jody. Thank you, Rabbi.
Shalom.